Welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Albert Chiu. Ukraine recently attacked the Russian city of Kursk using Australian drones, successfully destroying 5 Russian military aircrafts. The Russian Foreign Ministry commented Australia is increasingly getting involved in this conflict. Let's delve into how Australia is responding to the global reactions. Joining us today are Wen-Ti Sung, Atlantic Council Global China Hub Non-Resident Fellow and Australia National University Session Lecturer, and Jiho Chang, Keelung City DPP Councilor. A very warm welcome to all on the show. Wen-Ti, could you provide an overview of Australia's foreign policy philosophy? This is more like a broader way of looking at it as a start.
Right. Well, certainly a big topic. I think if I were to boil it down, then I will have to come down to the logic of chain gaining as well as independent foreign policy in the sense of middle power diplomacy. Chain gaining in the sense that Australia has a tradition of seeking security in community. So if you look at Australia before World War I, Australia used to foster a strong security relationship with the UK, back then the strongest power in the world. Since World War II, of course, then US has changed to become Australia's primary security partner of choice. And that has obviously been a long-standing factor in Australian foreign policy, that it always tried to stick with the US. Indeed, if you look at how Australian rhetoric toward US has been in past years, Australia always trying to emphasize this thing called 100 years of mateship. That means that for Australia-US relationship has been strong for a good century, and certainly since the end of the Second World War. For just about every single conflict that US is engaging overseas, Australia always sends its own security forces there to help out as well. So in that sense, Australia really tried to consolidate its security partnership with the world's leading superpower. If I may add, in addition to that, of course, Australia also has what it calls independent foreign policy, which means middle power diplomacy. Because Australia also at the same time knows that it's situated in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific. There's no NATO in Asia, and therefore Australia always need to find a way to get along with its own regional partners, some of which may, but others may not get along with the US. So that means that Australia always try to play that mediator role, if you will, between Western as well as other regional powers who may not always get along.
Well, it seems there is 2 polars, right? One is, as you say, engagement with the world or with allies. The other one is sort of like independence from others. So let's talk of the concepts of non-alignment movements. Would you say that the Australians' foreign policy in this regard is similar to India? And also my follow-up is that would you say that the relationship between US and Australia strengthened post the escalation of the US-China conflict?
So on the non-alignment movement issue, I think Australia is very different from India in the sense that India obviously in history tried to take a more middle stance between US and Soviet Union and then US and China, of course. Australia, however, has always tried to make it very strategically clear that if it absolutely has to choose, it would choose the US side. And you see that a lot more clearer in recent years as well when US-China rivalry begin to escalate. One factor, one issue, for example, is that Australia has been at the forefront of the Western world's call for independent investigation into the origin of COVID-19, for example, something for which that China has given Australia a lot of pain for. So that again goes to show that Australia takes a very clear stance in that strategic choice between US and China, and that Australia chooses the US as well as the Western camp by extension.
Right, Jiho, you probably can add up to Wen-Ti's comments in the sense that how does China or the CCP, to be specific, view Australia, and why was the relationship changed, from a sweet to now kind of sour relationship?
I'm pretty sure Australia, just like many other, say, medium-sized nations, the choice or options for their foreign policies is limited, just like Taiwan. So for medium, small-sized countries, the collectivist approach is almost the only way forward. So I think that's what Australia was trying to achieve in its independent endeavors. But on the other hand, I'm pretty sure since the 2000s, Australia, along with many other countries, including the United States, have had a very precise focus on the development of China and the China bi-relations of that specific countries. So China-Australian countries is probably the focus of the 2010s, and maybe even up to the 15s or 16s. And that, I think that's the reality for every other country as well. But ever since that, I'm pretty sure things have took another course. Ever since Xi Jinping took power, I think that's probably the catalyst for all the small changes and nuanced changes in foreign policy approaches of different countries as well, and Australia included. And so that's how I see it. Australia has increased its cooperation and investment in other Pacific nations as well as Southeast Asia like never before. Before 2015s or even in the early 2000s, that was not the case. All eyes were on China and for Australians. But this time around, Australia has found its way to elaborate or to spread its influence elsewhere for the sole purpose of having a collective approach to the new changes in Asia, which is almost like a shift in power balance. But now, I think ever since the China-US trade war, and with the increasing pressure from the big countries like Russia and China, since the Ukrainian wars, Australia has no other choice but to get more engaged with the U.S. war effort, as well as other effort to balance the region. So I think that's how I observe it.
Okay, let's now specifically look at the Australian Prime Minister. Since 2016, 3 Australian Prime Ministers, Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison, and Anthony Albanese, have advocated for Taiwan's significant role in the international community. While Prime Minister Albanese initially hesitated, he later supported Taiwan's aspiration to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreements for Trans-Pacific Partnership, so-called CPTPP. So Wen-Ti, my question goes to you. Can you recap Australia-China relations since 2016?
Okay, well, the short version is that things were relatively good for Australia-China relations in the early 2010s, and since 2016 or so, it took a downturn, and since 2020, it's been relatively bad. So if you look at early 2010s or 2014, for example, President Xi Jinping actually visited Australia on a state visit all the way to Canberra, including giving a speech in Australia's Parliament House. So that's how good things were back then, and Australia was in a position where it felt like U.S. could be Australia's security partner of choice, but China could be also a priority business partner at the same time. So that's back then when they could have the best of both worlds, if you will. Around 2016, 2017, however, things began to take a downturn as there were a number of high-profile cases involving alleged Chinese political interference in Australian politics. That led to a series of investigation, media outcry, and atmosphere became a lot more tense between Australia and China from that point onwards. And you see that reflected again in TV and mass entertainment even. There were a number of TV shows such as Secret City that explicitly talk about how China may have an interference or influence operation active in Australia. So you can see the wind was beginning to change in a different direction. And then we know ever since the onset of COVID, when Australia openly called for an independent WHO investigation into the origin of COVID-19, that really rubbed China the wrong way, and China retaliated with economic sanctions against Australian education, tourism, lobster, wine, coal, what have you. And that really just meant that relations between Australia and China were on the real downturn and something that still haven't bounced back from even this day.
Let's recap what you just said here. Is it fair for me to say that 2017 was the turning point to see the relationship start to soar, and the COVID-19 was right the movements where we see the maybe sort of like a semi-breakup between the two nations?
I think, in short, that's roughly the picture, yes. And there was a high-profile visuals towards the end of 2017 when Australia was at the height of discussion about Chinese political interference. When you saw at the end of 2017, Australian Prime Minister at the time, Malcolm Turnbull, went on Australian TV and said, much like Chairman Mao Zedong back in 1949 proclaimed that henceforth the Chinese people have stood up, facing escalating Chinese interference in Australian politics. Malcolm Turnbull proclaimed that at this moment and from that moment onwards, Australian people have also stood up against external influences, that is.
Okay, so I would still like to delve into Australia's domestic policy a bit, considering its parliamentary system with the multiple parties. Wen-Ti, could you outline which party or maybe in what political factions that favor China, or we can say that they are like China-friendly kind of party, which ones don't? Kind of introduce to our audience a bit.
I think the single most important thing to know is that there is bipartisan consensus within Australia on China policy, and that is to stand up for Australian values, number one. And that, of course, for Taiwan means that there is strong incentive for both sides of Australian politics to increase their engagement of and developing friendship with Taiwan. So that's number one.
I'm sorry, I would like to interrupt a little bit. So what's the Australian value? How would you describe? How would you define that?
Well, okay, I think that's a question obviously best left to the Australian office in Taipei. But if I were to try to, my guess would be coming from commitment to democracy, to liberalism, as well as to commitment to the fact that Australia is a multicultural nation full of immigrants. So that means Australia is dedicated to multicultural values as well as greater engagement with its Asian and Indo-Pacific neighbors by extension.
Okay.
That, of course, in strategic terms, will also mean that there will be value-based alignment diplomatically, something that has been working in Taiwan's favor, no doubt.
Yeah. I mean, it looks to me it's actually kind of in between a very soft approach and also the absolutely like United States hard approach, kind of in between out there from the Australian strategic. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So in terms of Australian politics, so yes, fact number one is bipartisan consensus. I think fact number two would be that yes, there are divergent faction or divergent voices on Australian politics when it comes to China policy. Much like US, you will have this thing called the climate left, which are usually left of center voters who think that cooperation with China is an important priority because China is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas, and therefore only through a good relationship with China can climate change be seriously tackled globally. That's the climate left. In addition, you have those voters who are more pacifists. A lot of them would be those who are still having a political equivalent of PTSD from the Vietnam War era. So there's a continued strain of anti-imperialist sentiment that to them often translates into anti-American sentiment that will lead them to portray America as a malign influence and then by extension, China as a more positive influence and a priority partner. That's the types of Australian voters who will be more China-friendly, let's say. On the other side will be the more hawkish or more assertive kind of voters. These are the people who are, again, putting democratic values front and center. Those who stand up for Australian sovereignty, including freedom from external interference. Let's just say that I think especially since 2020, the more value-oriented voters, the more assertive voters tend to be the ones that have the upper hand, which is why, again, I say that there is strong bipartisan consensus within Australia when it comes to prioritizing democratic partnership.
Okay, all right. That's very clear. It's good enough for us to understand the domestic components of the Australian politics. But now let's shift our focus a bit discuss what I said in the opener, Australia's policy toward Ukraine. So this one goes to Jiho. How has Australia concretely supported Ukraine against Russian aggression, according to your observation?
I think on the not just the new Australian administration, but also for the past few, you see this trend of moving towards, like Professor Sung was saying, a value-oriented approach to things, and I think that was put to test when Russia invaded Ukraine almost more than a year ago. And so Australian, although it's still, the foreign minister of Australia, I think Penny Wong, right? And she said that Australia is a medium-sized country, and I also said that earlier, but I think it's much more than just a medium-sized country. She's being very modest, but on the other hand, being a regional sort of power within Australia's sphere, they are providing everything they can to the war effort in Ukraine, I think much more earlier than some counterparts in Europe, I would say. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, explains a lot. That says a lot about how Australia positions itself in the fight against Russia in the Ukraine war effort. And I think it's also much more than just Ukraine, but Australia is providing these military equipment and assistance in its guideline, or it's a principle of protecting the small, protecting the medium-sized countries, and cooperating collectively with each other to prevent from big power subjugating the small neighbors, small powers around. So I think in that sense, we are seeing a very clear diplomatic approach from Australia, is that they are going to be fighting with the small guys. Okay. They're going to fighting with the underdogs.
Okay. All right, Wen-Ti, when we talk about the Ukrainian war, we need to also address the topic of NATO, right? So how does Australia and NATO get along? I mean, specifically friends, right? Would you kind of say something about that?
Right, so Australia and NATO obviously have ongoing dialogue partnership agreements. Mm-hmm. I think Australia is one of the few ones that have that arrangement with NATO. Of course, from U.S. perspective, Australia is one of those what they call major non-NATO allies. Mm-hmm. So through those channels, I think Australia has a lot of room for engagement with NATO as well as other European-oriented Western nations, and that, of course, paved the way towards more security cooperation. On France, more specifically, we know that Australia signed this thing called AUKUS, which is a US, UK, Australia trilateral security arrangement. Part of that deal involved Australia terminating its prior submarines arrangement with France. Right. Australia was going to buy a lot of submarines from France. So that deal was terminated as part of AUKUS. So that led to year and a half, 2 years or so, a relatively negative relationship between Australia and France. That, however, has largely been, perhaps not completely, but largely resolved by the two sides. The Australian side worked out a deal with France earlier this year when Australia agreed to pay a reasonable, essentially contract-breaking fee to France to show that Australia is sorry. Okay. In addition to that, geopolitically, France is one of the few European nations to have strong presence in both the Pacific Ocean, in places like New Caledonia, for example, as well as the Indian Ocean, places like Reunion Island, for example. So in that sense, France is a natural partner of choice for Australia caught in between those two oceans. So there's a lot of room for them to explore security cooperation.
Okay, now let's quickly move into the second topic, which is the Australia-Taiwan relations. Trade first. Taiwan and Australia have developed a stronger trade relationship over the past several years. The top 5 items exported from Australia to Taiwan comprise coal, iron ore, aluminum, refined copper, and zinc, Conversely, the leading exports from Taiwan to Australia encompass petroleum-related products, telecommunication devices, computer and their components, and even tobacco-related products and integrated circuits. So, Jiho, can you kind of evaluate the current state of the Australia-Taiwan trade relations? Because from the CG we just saw, obviously that Taiwan is pretty strong in technology.
Yeah, and you will continue to be so. So I'm pretty sure this also it's not just Taiwan-Australian relations. I'm pretty sure quite a few countries have this kind of Taiwan high-tech export-oriented trade going on, and Australia is not exception. And it will continue to do so because I'm pretty sure that in the coming decades, especially with the development of AI and other assorted technological advances, Taiwan will play an even more crucial role in the technological development and the trade relations between Taiwan and other countries. So in that sense, Australia has always been the top choices for Taiwan in raw materials, and not just all these minerals and other raw materials, but like agricultural products like beef and even wine are very popular in Taiwan, and they are going to even increase even more with the strengthening of the Taiwan-Australian relations. We are seeing it happening, right? Like as we speak, it's strengthening, and Taiwan is strengthening its relations with other partners in Pacific as well. And so, and Australia is like the top priority for Taiwan in that region.
Wen-Ti, did you find anything that surprised you, because we list the top 5 items on both sides in trade relations?
So, I mean, those visuals themselves do not surprise me. There is, what they show to me is a high degree of trade complementarity between what Australia is good at and what Taiwan is good at in terms of the kind of goods and services they each specialize in. So that naturally leads us to wonder, why then is there still no free trade agreement between Australia and Taiwan? Because I think among Australia's trade partners, I think Taiwan is the one with the highest trade volume and still doesn't have an active free trade agreement with. So that's something that I think the two sides have been trying to work on, that used to suffer more obstacles in the way of, for example, some of them will argue that Australia should try to sign a free trade deal with China first, and the Australia-Taiwan one can wait until after that. But there has been a China-Australia FTA deal that's been signed, but there's no Australia-Taiwan one in the horizon anytime soon just yet. So I think maybe that's one area that can work on.
We also found that Australia office in Taiwan has ramped up its activities recently, frequently inviting Taiwanese politicians and journalists. These events, previously discreet, has become more prominent. Why is Australia showing increased interest in Taiwan? I mean, China might be one reason. What else? I mean, does Taiwan now have a different meaning to Australia governments, Wen-Ti?
I think 2 reasons. I think empathy and security. Empathy in the sense that I sort of feel it's the most strongest, because I mean, I've been teaching a few times, of course, about this issue in the past. I think there's a sense of camaraderie between Australia and Taiwan for both being the subject of being on the receiving end of China economic sanctions over the last few years. China sanctioned Taiwan pineapple, among many other things, of course. And then China, of course, also sanctioned Australian wine, lobster, coal, iron ore, and what have you. So I think when this story was beginning to get a lot more exposure in the Australian press, it got into the Australian public conscious that, hey, this is a democracy we share values with and we share common experience with. Not to mention, of course, that for the last couple of years, Taiwan has always been a major issue for Australian public debates. There's so much perception of shared security, and there's concern within Australia about if a Taiwan-Strait conflict does occur, what would that mean for Australia?
You know, talking about the Taiwan contingency, Jiho, alongside Japan and India, Australia are Quad members, right? Given the regular joint military exercise between Australia and other Quad members in the event of Taiwan contingency, how likely do you think that Australia is to project its military force in the Taiwan Strait?
The likelihood is not as great as other, like the Indian or Japanese presence in the Taiwan Strait. But sending troops over directly over here, I think that's for now it doesn't seem as likely as other countries. But because we are seeing AUKUS and other Australian engagement, especially in geopolitical cooperations, getting even more serious. It's really hard to tell, but it can happen. We could see something like that happen. But on the other hand, we are also seeing some politicians in Australia, before our camera starts to roll, I asked Professor about the role of former Prime Minister Keelung, how he viewed Australian engagement with Taiwan is a dangerous bid. Okay. And so if that voice gets stronger, then there is a possibility that Australia might just opt as just supporting role in the war effort.
Okay, but also follow up. Do you think that on the parts of Taiwan, any potential for Taiwanese military to collaborate with Australia militarily, in the future?
I see that happening.
What about you, Wen-Ti?
There's definitely scope for further collaboration, especially in multilateral settings.
Okay, all right. Thank you for both for the great comments. Today, we explored Australia's geopolitical strategies and actions and how Taiwan can potentially align with them. Enjoying this episode, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment on our YouTube channel and remember to subscribe to Taiwan Talks. Until we meet again, take care.